Welcome to the Boulder Psychic Institute and to the Church of Divine Light. I want to thank you all for coming today to pay tribute to the life of Douglas Stanley Szycher. We gather in gratitude for the love, wisdom, and generosity that he shared with us. He touched our lives with his quiet, steady kindness from the day he was born on February 14th, 1950, until his fatal motorcycle accident just a few short weeks ago. He lived a life of service, both physically and spiritually, openly and authentically. We've gathered both to celebrate Doug's life and to recognize our loss. We've come to remember the time we spent with Doug, to grieve our relationship with him, to say goodbye to him, and to open ourselves to the life of spirit. While we honor Doug's entrance into the spiritual realm, we must also reconcile the dawn of our lives without his physical presence. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there's a time to be born and there's a time to die. We may not understand why Doug died, but we do know that it was his time. Let us begin with a Buddhist prayer that in some traditions is recited every day for the first 49 days after a person's passing. Note that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are not gods or deities. They represent the compassionate and enlightened aspect in all humans who make the commitment to put others first. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, abiding in all directions, endowed with great compassion, endowed with love, affording protection to sentient beings, consent through the power of your great compassion to come forth. O compassionate ones, you who possess the wisdom of understanding, the love of compassion, the power of protecting in incomprehensible measure. Douglas Szycher is passing from this world to the next. The light of this world has faded for him. He has entered solitude with his karmic forces. He has gone into a vast silence. He is borne away by the great ocean of birth and death. O compassionate ones, protect Douglas Szycher, who is defenseless. Be to him like a father and a mother. O compassionate ones, let not the force of your compassion be weak, but aid him. Forget not your ancient vows. While it's true that in spirit nothing is ever lost or broken, it's also true that there can be a sense of emptiness when we think of someone we loved who has passed. We miss Doug's companionship and presence, and our grief is deeply personal. Recognizing our needs for solace and understanding during a time of loss reminds us of the fundamental importance of both spiritual and personal community. When we feel alone or sad, the presence of friends and family can be healing. Strength comes from the close personal support and acceptance of those who love us. During times of grief, expressions and acts of kindness are particularly beautiful. They serve as examples of the unwavering love of God. Throughout this time of transition and grieving, we ask for especially tender support of those closest to Doug, including his wife, Heidi Szycher, his son, Ben Szycher, his brother, Stuart Szycher, his sister, Aline Maroney, as well as his beloved family members and treasured friends. Let us take a moment to offer a prayer of healing as we recognize the personal loss we are all experiencing. Dear God, we ask you to heal the heartbroken and to bind up their wounds. Mercifully look upon those who are at this time bereaved. Be near them in their sorrow, and let their sorrow draw them near to you. May the things unseen and eternal grow more real, more present, more full of meaning and power. Let your strength sustain their weakness, and let your peace fill their minds with perfect trust in you. Amen. While we are aware of our loss, we must remember that Doug will always be alive in spirit, as well as a part of the lives he touched. As a husband, father, friend, handyman, naturalist, athlete, seeker, and healer, Doug shared with us many legacies which live in our hearts as a part of who we have become. I'd like to set an intention to guide us through this time. It's derived from the Buddhist practice metta, which is also known as the practice of loving kindness. May I be peaceful, may I be happy, may I be well, may I be safe, may I be free from suffering. May all beings be peaceful, may all beings be happy, may all beings be well, may all beings be safe, may all beings be free from suffering. Our service today is twofold. We are here to remember and release what has been by recognizing the humanity of our love, our shared stories, and our histories. Yet we also open our hearts today that our relationships might be reborn through grace. This afternoon, we remember the life, both temporal and eternal, of Doug, whom we loved so dearly. We let go of what has been in order to embrace and recognize what is. Memorials force us to reflect on life's true value. When we pause to look back, it is the love and laughter, as well as the peace of a life lived in happy relationship that really counts. It's the deeds done from genuine affection that add depth. It's the sense of belonging in the world, as well as belonging to a group of people who love us without conditions, that add meaning and joy to our lives. Doug's participation in our lives contributed to our growth and development. He enriched our lives. We are grateful for the time we spent with him, and we will miss him. Doug was born and raised in New Jersey. He graduated high school in 1968 at the height of the Vietnam War. To exert as much agency as possible over his fate, he enlisted in the Navy rather than wait to be drafted. Most of his time in the service was spent in Japan, where he received recognition for his sharpshooting abilities and where he learned to build bombs. The Navy stored the bombs underground because they did not want any friction or sparks to ignite the explosives. They commissioned goats to graze on the grass that covered the area where the bombs were stored. Hence, Doug says that he spent most of his time in the military working as a goat herder in Japan. Notably, Doug also spent his time as a sailor in the Mediterranean. While in Japan, he traveled extensively through Southeast Asia, and while in the Mediterranean, he toured Europe. He returned to New Jersey, transformed by his service and travels. When a friend asked who would like to drive with him in a van to California, well, Doug volunteered. It was the early 70s, and although Doug felt like he missed much of the hippie movement by being overseas during the summer of love, his story has a quintessentially hippie flavor. After exploring the West Coast with his friend, they were on their way back to New Jersey when they stopped in Netherlands. It was in the middle of a snowstorm, and Doug fell in love with the mountains and the wilderness. Doug called his parents to let them know that he would not be returning to New Jersey. He found a home in Colorado. He lived in the mountains for many years and at one point got mixed up in a drug sting operation carried out by the DEA. Although he faced a possible sentence of over 40 years, the judge did recognize that he had been set up and reduced his sentence to 3 months. But that ordeal set Doug on a path of spiritual self-exploration which lasted the rest of his life. He began practicing yoga, visiting hot springs, attending healing retreats, observing nature, and even studying art at the University of Colorado. In the process of creating a life in Colorado, Doug worked in many capacities. He sold suits, shoes, and carpets, managed a natural fiber clothing store. He was a landlord. He showed horses in Western-style competitions. He built negative ion generators. He was an inline skater. He sold elite fiberglass skates that molded to the competitors' feet. And he managed an orchid warehouse.
Unique.
Very unique. He lived a full life. Most of his time, though, included his work as a handyman. The final project of the VOTEC program he took to enhance his handyman skills involved building a house with his classmates from start to finish. Doug often credited this undertaking with teaching him the ins and outs of house construction. It's part of the reason that he was so knowledgeable and skilled in home repair. From electricity to plumbing to carpentry to painting, he could do it all. And Doug also brought his artistic eye and caring nature to the projects he undertook as well. In my eye, he was in all aspects a true house healer. Eventually, Doug settled into a routine of working as a handyman during the week and bicycling, motorcycling, and hiking during the weekends. One of Doug's longest and dearest friends has offered to share his thoughts on Doug's life. I would like to welcome Stephen Harrison.
So I think a lot of people will be sharing their memories today. But I met Doug about the time the DEA was done with him. And it was 1977 maybe, and he was a hippie, and I was a hippie. And the meeting was actually quite deep. Despite our youth, or maybe because of it, we had a meeting of heart. And the question of what actually was this manifest life all about? That question actually traveled with Doug and in our relationship throughout the entirety of that 40-some years. And the interesting thing about Doug is he carried that question with tremendous curiosity. There was almost a childlike quality. It was wrapped up perhaps with layers of life experience, like the proverbial onion in the spiritual literature. You know, there was the layer of the childhood and the layer of the high school where he wasn't exactly the top student, and the Navy where, you know, he herded goats, but, you know, it was also a rough space for somebody like Doug in an era when there was a lot of conflict in the culture. Doug was not necessarily on the side of the Vietnam War. And there was the layer of this hippie fellow suddenly coming upon a state of consciousness and not quite sure what to do with it. He became a Hindu almost immediately and did his meditation, did his yoga, and then we met. And the question was, is truth a place of a path or is it pathless? And that question of the pathless truth really was the non-organizing principle from that point forward for Doug. And so for those, I'm sure everyone here who has encountered Doug felt that quality in him. And the thing that I think was remarkable about Doug was that he was not remarkable. He was every man. He had a life which was, you know, engaged. It was engaged in learning about how to live life. You know, he came into that space of consciousness, like many of us, with no real knowledge of how to live a life. And so he engaged that with a lot of curiosity. And you know, if you were to have I imagine having a conversation with Doug that goes something like, how do you live a good life? And it's, well, make good decisions. Well, how do you make good decisions? Experience. And well, how do you get that experience? Making bad decisions. And the ability to fail and to learn to fail, to learn how to fail. He was a guy who failed a lot in the early days in the school system, Navy, and he felt that failure as failure. I think he learned as he lived his life that failure was actually the process to learning. And he became very good at that curiosity. So this quality of every man, this man who has this deep insight, this deep heart, and yet has to live in the world, but not of the world. So for those who had Doug as a handyman, for example, you would notice that, well, in my experience, he was never on time. So you could say he was in a timeless space. But we also know that he was not on time because he had run into somebody who he talked with. And maybe some of the people in this room are people who he was talking with while I was waiting for him. Or maybe he was talking with me while you were waiting for him. But this ability to be a common man and to engage on that level, So he was, he would take a long time to finish those projects. Sometimes they just seemed like they went on, and I often wondered if it was just because, he wanted to stop by again. If he finished it efficiently, he'd be done. But he might want to stop by and check in, get that shower running again, or whatever it was that he was doing. So he was kind of a mystical guy from my perspective, guised in a common person. Underneath those layers, so he has that layer of the high school and the Navy and the hippie and the spiritual, and then he falls in love with Colette, and he has Ben. OMG. What does a wild hippie guy, a rebel without a cause, what does he do? He has to substantiate. He has to learn how to support and to be steady. And that's a big challenge for him. And he did it. And he continued to do that. And then he became a former husband, but still a father. And he went on and learned how to do that really beautifully, really, really beautifully. And then he became a new husband, and that was really a beautiful occurrence for him. He went through a very difficult time before that, and he fell in love, and there was a great healing in that space, which is really a wonderful thing. The thing that I think I want to say about Doug is that space that I think we can all touch into right now, that space of the heart, that space is still here. And that space, even though the form of Doug has changed and the form of each of us will change, because form changes, but that essence that we noticed in him, that we were touched by in him, that's still here. That's all I have to say about Doug. He was a good friend.
Thank you, Stephen.
Very beautiful. He was often not on time, but I will say for his singing bowl service, he was always on time for that because that was one of his favorite things to do. So Doug showed us what he valued in the ways that he lived his life. He cared for life by embracing physical health, the natural environment, and spiritual awareness. Doug's commitment to maintaining his health was evident in all of his choices, from his daily exercise routine to his vegetarian diet. Having been an elite inline skater for about 15 years, second in his class in the country, and having bicycled regularly with the Louisville Cyclery Club for nearly as long, he was in tip-top shape. His physical energy really enhanced his engagement with all of the other activities that he undertook. Steve Schwarting cycled with Doug in the Louisville Cyclery Club. While Steve could not attend the service today, he wrote the following recollections of his rides with Doug. So reading Steve's story is one of Doug's local friends, Michael Kahn. Welcome, Michael. Thank you.
I just have a comment to start. Doug, I've known Heidi for almost 30 years, and I met Doug as they were courting. And one thing about Doug is he quickly became what I call a dear friend. And I think anybody that knows him, I think considers him a dear and close friend. So those are my personal words. And now I'm going to read Steve's thoughts. They're kind of random, and he wrote them down as he thought them. All I did was correct his English. So I met Doug in 1999 when I first moved here from Illinois. I bought a road bike from Louisville Cyclery and started attending their group rides. I remember my first conversation with Doug during a Saturday ride out on the roads east of I-25. We got to talking, and I remembered asking him about the brand of his bike. I told him, that's a nice bike, but I had never heard of the brand before. Looking back on that conversation, I now know Doug was extremely kind in his answer back to me. My question showed how absurdly little I knew about bikes at the time. It was equivalent of what I had said I had never heard of a Ford truck before. What's that? His bike was made by a company known to everybody, except me. Anyway, I remember him just smiling and then explaining to me very patiently the brand of his bike, who makes it, and how he came to choose it, and why he liked it. He could have laughed and poked fun of me, but he didn't. He recognized me for what I was. Just someone new to the sport who didn't know much. In Doug's mind, there was no need to make fun of me. Others would have jumped at the chance. Doug was not that way. He never took advantage of situations or made someone feel small. Over the next couple of years, I got to know Doug very well. Probably rode with him 3 times a week, so we spent many hours together. I always enjoyed riding with him. I enjoyed talking with him, and I was always disappointed when he didn't show up for a ride. He just made you feel welcome, and he was just a fantastic biker. I think anyone who has ever ridden with him will tell you that same story. He would just power his way through the rides and could keep up with the best. Even people whose very lives revolved around biking and racing and nothing else, he was simply amazing. Everyone would say, "Who is this guy?" I came to find out, too, that he was an avid rollerblader and competed in races all over the United States. So he was very fit. I also remember a time years later that we both ended up buying the same type of bike at the same time. One time, shortly after we both had gotten our bikes, I went over to his house for the first time. I didn't remember why, but he showed me his home, his backyard, his dog, his birds, and I remember saying, "Where's your new bike?" And I kid you not, he pointed up to his bedroom, where he slept, and sure enough, his brand new Lightspeed bike was in his bed. He laughed and said, "I love it so much, I sleep with it. It's my baby." That was who Doug was. He loved to bike. He loved pushing himself. He never raced bikes, but he trained like an animal. I would tease him all the time, saying, "Why are you grinding your gears so hard to get up that hill? Switch into an easier gear." And everyone who knows him knows this. He never would. He would say no, and he prefers to power his way up the climbs that he enjoyed, and he enjoyed suffering and make it hurt. I remember asking him many times why he must have heard that phrase from, this is where he got a little off on his English. I remember asking him many times that why he doesn't race, and he would say, "I'm just not interested in that. I just enjoy being out on my bike." I must have heard that phrase hundreds of times. I just enjoy being out on my bike. I also remember one time when I started racing. He had come out to watch. After my warm-up, I rode over to him and asked him, "Do you have any advice for me?" He looked at me and said with a smile, "Yeah, don't break." I laughed, and every time I raced for the next 15 years, I heard Doug in my head telling me, "Don't break, don't break." And then I would hear him laugh. It always helped me curb my anxiety before a race. I loved his sense of humor. He had a unique way of breaking things down and making them simple. Doug, over the years, became a friend to me and to the bike too, and off the bike too. He would help me with stuff around my house, fixing toilets, doing electrical work, putting up trim, installing cabinets. He was extremely patient and kind with me. Not just doing work for me, but showing me and teaching me how to do it myself. One of the things I loved about Doug was the way he was always smiling, always happy to see you, genuinely in fact, and I can attest to that myself. In fact, I never got the impression from him that he disliked anyone. He always engaged everyone and made them feel welcome and important. One time, in fact, he showed up at our house with gifts for my 2 boys, who were very little at the time. My wife and I were blown away by his thoughtfulness. He sat our kids down and showed them what he brought for them and made a really big deal of it, building the excitement up. I remember our kids' eyes went so wide, but more importantly, I could see the pleasure in Doug's face as he brought joy to our family. He was happy to make us happy. It was that simple. Again, he was kind and gracious, and he expected nothing in return, and he was happy, very happy to do it. That says a lot about a person, and I remember the act of kindness and selflessness to this day. It made such an important impression on me. On the bike, we would have long conversations about life, about nature, about politics, about religion, and about people. Sometimes we would agree, and sometimes we would disagree. And when we disagreed, it never mattered or impacted our friendship in the slightest. We enjoyed hearing each other's point of view. In all our conversations, he would never forget to ask about my wife and sons. And he would talk at length about his son, what he was doing, what he was up to, his hopes and his dreams for him, his struggles in being a parent. He confides in me a lot of things and wore his heart on his sleeve sometimes. I remember him telling me about a trip he went on with his son to South America, and what an amazing experience he had been able to go there with him. It was just a trip of a lifetime for him. It was a chance to show his son the beauty of the world and share the experience with someone he loved the most. It was very touching to me as how he described it. I liked Doug so much that when he didn't show up for rides, I was disappointed. A couple of weeks would go by, and if he didn't show up, I'd give him a call and coax him into coming back, which he would, but ultimately he would show up less and less. I remember calling him and saying I missed him and his way to connect. Several times I convinced him to let me join him. We rode up to Raymond together, get on Peak to Peak Highway, and go past Peaceful Valley, the very place where he lost his life. I remember those rides up there in a particular spot like it was yesterday. I remember him telling me that this was his favorite ride and how much he loved it. I remember us both telling each other how lucky we were to live in Colorado and how much it meant to us. We always remarked about it. What a beautiful day, he would say, and I would say yes. We are really lucky to be out here and be able to do this. I never want to take it for granted. It was like we were holding each other accountable to do just that. Never take it for granted, always appreciate it.
Thank you. You can take a few moments to come through and find a seat if it's more comfortable.
Can you sit down in the chair?